This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 367. Should we all earn less?
The last 7 deals that I've been involved with, there were 2.5 million stockholders who have made a pre-tax profit of $12 billion.
Most people, most of your listeners are savers, and that means they'll be net buyers, and they should want the stock market to go down. They should want to buy at a lower price.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, this week, are we earning too much? So much so that we can put our excess cash into speculative assets like shares, and these days government bonds, they're pretty speculative as well. We might not do that directly, but our pension fund does. So are we earning more than we need now so that we have more later? So what would happen if we earned a bit less? Would it hit productivity, or would it just mean we had less for later? In other words, should we actually all earn a bit less? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So what is the impact of us all having more disposable income? If we're all wanting the same things, like houses, for example, doesn't that just inflate prices? If we all earned a little less, could we correct this supply-demand imbalance, which is driving those prices up right now, and have less to push into the finance sector as well if we did that? What if we all earned just enough to get by? What would that do to the economy if we were to replace greed as the driving force for the economy? And look, the cash we have left over, obviously we do invest in the finance sector, helping the wealthy get wealthier and widening the income gap. And of course, it was Keynes who talked about us working just 15 hours a week. Instead, we are working longer than ever, because if you just work 15 hours, then you would earn even more, wouldn't you? You'd just say, well, if I can get by on 15 hours, I'll work 40 hours and earn perhaps 3 times as much. But if it was 15 hours, what would that do to the economy? So, Steve, UK average weekly earnings are currently £663. In 2000, it was £307. Now, if wages had grown in line with inflation, then the average would only be £544. So we are 20% more than you'd expect them to be right now. Presumably, that's because either we've seen increases in productivity, working longer hours, or workers are cutting into producers' margins, so they're getting paid more and companies are paying less for other stuff. So how is that sustainable? Is it any wonder lately, perhaps, that we've seen real wages coming down? What's going on?
I think we need to do a bit of distributional discussion here, mate, and I very much doubt that the
So the word average you've got a bit of a problem with there.
The word average is a problem. I mean, and London, I think an old classic story about a country which was average income was $500 million a year, and half the population suddenly died because one person's earning $1 million, the other's earning nothing. It's not quite that severe in the UK, but I've been gobsmacked by what I learned that people earn in the finance sector, and equally gobsmacked in the opposite direction by what I know from personal experience people earn in academic life, and what they get in schools, and what they earn as nurses, and any segment of the population which is either paid for by the state these days, where the wages have been screwed by the state's capacities to not pass on wage rises, or not pass on wage rises greater than the rate of inflation. So it's a distributional thing. And I think I've used it several times, but my favourite was an extreme example of a friend's wife who was a top, and this is from her own personal recollection, she was a top earner in finance, and then got sick of the stress in finance and decided to work in education, and saw her salary drop by a factor of 30. She went from a salary of £750,000 a year to a salary of £25,000 a year. And that salary, the finance salary, did not include her bonus. So there's an incredible skew in salaries when you include the city. And if you take the city out of those, I think you'll find your average falls below the rate of inflation in terms of the rate of increase of wages rather than above.
And yet there's enough people obviously earning enough to be able to push house prices ever higher. So that again
brings us back to the finance sector, because what's going on is an enormous increase in availability of debt for the private sector. And this, with the UK's case, this began in 1982 when Thatcher deregulated bank lending to households. And at that stage, one of the most remarkable charts I've seen in all the data I've put together is the ratio of private debt to GDP in the UK. And if you go back to the pre-Thatcher period, the level of private debt to GDP, with the data that the UK was providing, that there's been some reclassification, so it's slightly different now than when I first saw it. But between 1880 and 1982, the level of private debt in the UK never exceeded 73% of GDP. And then when Thatcher deregulated lending to the property sector, what happened beforehand was building societies controlled lending to the household sector. When that deregulation was done, the level of debt went from 73% to 210%. Now, most of that went into house prices. So what we've seen again is the finance sector has got the high wages and the finance sector has inflated house prices.
Yeah, well, so salaries since 2000 have gone up in absolute terms 116%. House prices have gone up from 81,000 to 261,000. So that is basically, it's increased at double the rate of the increase in salaries. So people are earning a bit more, but they are spending a lot more on their house, and that adds to your case about it's all funded by debt. So we obviously have to bring that debt down because that's what's inflating house prices. But isn't the ideal scenario that most people are earning pretty similar to what they want to spend? So we don't, that consumption and income are as close as possible. But I mean, the reason I'm asking that question is if you get a great imbalance, if people are earning a great deal more than they want to spend, then that money is going to find itself in the finance sector somehow, isn't it? Because you're going to invest it into pension funds.
Well, this is the thing. Again, the finance sector's taken over the bloody economy, and I'm now looking at the data that I need to make that comment. And if I work just with the data for the Bank of International Settlements, they only go back to 1941. But if you look there, and this is the revised data that the British are now sending the Bank of International Settlements. So between looks like 1965 they start with the data for the UK. 1965 to 1998, roughly, the level of private debt was normally below 80% of GDP. It then skyrocketed starting in 1998 from 80% of GDP to 220% of GDP. And this was all during the period of responsible management of debt, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, governments were obsessing about the level of government debt and ignoring the level of private debt, which is the usual hang-up of neoclassical economists. That's what you had an increase in people's debt levels, which was matched by the increase in money, credit-created money in the economy. But as modern monetary theory advocates emphasise all the time, there's no changing the net financial worth in that situation. If you borrow money and you therefore have more money, but you also have more debt, there's zero change in your net worth. The way that people try to make that into an actual change in the net worth is to speculate on rising house prices, and that's what gave us the house price bubble in the UK.
So is there an ideal situation then where you have got? Let's forget about the extremes. Let's assume everyone is average for a moment, and we'll look at the distribution impacts in just a second.
That's not a bad way to work. Okay.
So if everyone earns the same amount of money, what's the ideal? Should I be? I mean, what's an acceptable level of debt for me to be able to buy things like property, and how much more than I spend should I be earning? Well,
this is the thing. This is one of the traps of macroeconomics. In the aggregate, spending is identical to income. Okay, because if I bought your microphone off you, or you bought my mouse off me, then what is my spending is your income, and vice versa. So in the aggregate, individuals cannot save. Okay. And in fact, individuals can save, societies can't. And what we call saving is actually an increase in the amount of money in the economy, and that, again, at the net level, because the sum of all financial assets is zero. You're finding if I owed you money for a mortgage, then we add the two together. The sum of what I owe you and what pardon me, I get jumbled when I use those words, even when I haven't got COVID. But if your asset and my liability added together sum to zero, and then that applies it. Yeah. So if you want to have an increase in your money supply, you have to have some other agent having a decrease in their value, and the only agent that can do that on a sustained basis is the government.
Right. So if the government did nothing, then my income and consumption, everyone's income and consumption, should be the same, or it should at least level out the same. And
the sum level will be the same because that's a macroeconomic principle. The income is expenditure, but in terms of your
the only way you get growth then in that case is by borrowing with money that's created.
Either borrowing or the government running up what we call government debt, which is actually a record of government money creation. So if you want to have aggregate savings, then you have to have by the non-government sector, then you have the government sector creating that net net savings by the non-government sector by spending more than it takes back in taxation to precisely the same degree. That's the only way you can do it.
So if the government does nothing, if there's no money coming from the government, no extra spending from the government, and banks are not lending out, then the only way I can say that I have more money than I am spending, I'm earning more than I'm spending, is because somebody else is doing the opposite.
In the sense that in terms of financial assets, and this is the crazy thing is we've had 40 or 50 years of an obsession about government debt in neoclassical economics, in policy driven by neoclassical economics. And what that has meant is that the government has not been creating net financial assets for the private sector, which means the private sector can't actually, in the aggregate, accumulate additional money. And that's pushed them into the hands of the private sector, where they also can't get net financial assets, because if you borrow money off a bank, then the money you have is identical to the debt you've borrowed from the bank. But the difference is you can go and gamble and speculate with that money on the value of non-financial assets, And non-financial assets are things like houses, where it's an asset to the owner, but not a liability to anybody else. And then the valuation we put on that is actually driven by the amount of money we're willing to borrow to buy them. So we get this crazy self-reinforcing cycle of rising house prices and rising levels of private debt, and then the crunch we saw back in 2008. So it's just a recipe for craziness, and that's fundamentally the state of the UK economy.
Right, and many other economies around the world, Canada, Australia, etc. Anywhere where there's this high level of debt. So, but if I buy that house, if I'm somebody who buys a house that's worth a great deal, I mean, I'm paying somebody that money. That money is still circulating in the economy.
Exactly. It ends up, the financial claims continue circulating. And the value we put on a non-financial asset is not money. People will, they'll some say, well, my house is worth, £2 million, and I've got $100,000 in the pounds in the bank, so I'm worth £2.1 million. But the thing is that $100,000 you can spend instantly. You want to spend the house, it's a bit more complicated. So,
but I'm getting the money from the house. So if I buy and sell houses, and that's my income, that is why is that any different to somebody who makes cream scones? Obviously, they have to make a lot more cream scones than the person buying and selling houses, but that's their income. That's their job. That's how
they make it. But it's driven by credit for buying existing assets, which is not production. And this is the other reason why it's so frustrating to see people being obsessed by rising house prices as if that's a sign of a healthy economy. You're trading, you're buying and selling second-hand assets with each other. And the only way that works is if there are new entrants who are going to bring in more borrowed money yet again to continue inflating it. So it is nothing like selling more widgets or creating a new form of widget and marketing that, which is how we actually measure genuine economic growth. The usual caveat that growth is not exactly a healthy obsession either in the environmental crisis we're now in. But the way you get the increase in output, which you're wanting, and the level of effective prosperity from wages you're wanting, is for that money that exists to turn over more rapidly. And what we have an obsession about the amount of money we have and the value of our assets, but not how fast that money is turning over, and therefore how productive the assets are. And that's what we should be focusing on.
Yeah, which means which is the real economy rather than the asset-driven economy. So the thing is, I mean, we have so many asset classes now because there are people with this imbalance between how much they have to spend to get by. They've bought their jet skis, they've got a nice house, they've still got a lot of money left over, they've got a couple of nice houses. What else do they do? So that's where you start to have more asset classes created. So crypto, for example, exists as an asset class so that people can put money into it, because if they didn't put it into crypto, they were putting it into other asset classes and inflating the prices of whatever that is that they're buying, whether it's houses or whether it's the share market or whatever. So this is the intrinsic problem, isn't it? That there's a lot of we have to keep on adding to that whole depth of asset classes to be able to give a suitable return to all this money which is swirling around in the finance
sector. Which is
sector.
Not doing anything genuinely productive, because again, this is why if you look at, people are beginning to look back at the 50s and 60s more and more and say, well, why can't we have things like we had back then? Because even though the level of effective wealth was lower and the quality of housing stock and things like that were lower and the cars weren't as good, blah, 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 there was a sense in which people were making money out of production, out of generating new goods and the turnover of existing money. And you had a higher rate of turning over of money back then than we have now. So what we actually had by obsessing upon the value of our assets and focusing on non-financial assets, in particular housing and shares, is that we've neglected that we actually produce output by manufacturing new goods and by investment. And that's back in the 50s and 60s, that was the focus. That was the so-called bad Keynesian days. They were actually better capitalist days than what we're going through right now. We've gone from capitalism to the casino.
Right, but a far worse standard of living. That's the problem, isn't it? Whenever you level that argument, people are always going to say, well, hang on, just look how we were living in the 50s and 60s. So I was, But
that's got to do with productivity and technology.
It's all technology. So just as for example, my grandmother, to heat the house, had to light the coal fire because the water was heated by basically by a container behind the coal fire that heated the water for the central heating. So if you wanted to have a hot shower in the morning, you had to light a coal fire downstairs first and let it warm up. And I think they still had an outside toilet. This was in the early 60s. So that's
and my mother and father, similar sort of story, living in a terrace house. Yeah, and Dad finally bought a very sexist relationship with my mother, described it. My father was a great guy, but he was a very typical guy as well. So he had only bought a washing machine, one of the newfangled washing machines with a wringer, when he walked in and saw my mother in exhaustion cranking the hand wringer and just almost falling asleep on the wringer, like head on her hand on one arm while she cranked with the other to hand crank the clothing to get the moisture out of the clothing. And that's when Dad went out and bought a mechanical washing machine, and Mum would laugh at him bringing in friends to actually show off the washing machine, which of course was her responsibility to operate. So yes, there was going to be an incredible increase in the living standard of living, and it's fundamentally because technological change has meant we are using more energy. And the energy which comes from fossil fuels, not burnt in the house anymore, as your grandmother's example, but burnt in a coal-fired power station somewhere. That has given us our productivity. Right. And of course, that's equally been dangerous for our long-term future.
Right. So in answer to our question this week, are we earning too much? It seems like the answer is, well, some people are. So the question is, what do we do about that? And that seems like a convenient point to break. And we'll look at what, perhaps the public policy response to that is, which is dangerous, isn't it? Because the moment you start saying, well, some people are just earning too much, then we'll look at what the impacts of that are. But of course, the moment you start saying that, then you start getting branded as, communists or extreme socialists, and you're trying to take away the ambition of people to earn money. So we'll look at, how can you do that without taking away that ambition or the benefits that some people being rich might actually create for society. We'll do that when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So, Steve, it was 1930 when John Maynard Keynes predicted that by 2030, 100 years later, we'd all be working 15 hours per week. It was in a paper called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. I think actually it wasn't a big paper for him. I think it was back of envelope stuff. But it's obviously a big thing has been made out of this. And he says those 15 hours, we wouldn't need to do those. It's just we need to do some work so that we felt contented. For 3 hours a day. That would satisfy the old Adam, whatever that is, in most of us. And he thought the rich would be doing more for themselves as well, for the same reason, that they would enjoy those small duties, those tasks and routines that would give their life some meaning. I'm not really quite sure whether Elon Musk empties the dishwasher myself, so perhaps this wasn't one of his greatest predictions, was it?
No, not by a long shot. And again, this reminds me, having read John Kenneth Galbraith's The New Industrial State recently for its, I think, the 50th or 75th anniversary, 50, I think it was. And he had the same sense of an ever-improving future that Keynes had in the economic prospects for our grandchildren. And they really thought the progress they'd seen over the 1920s in Keynes's case and the 1960s and 70s in Galbraith's case, they thought that's going to continue. And it's all been corrupted, and it comes back to two factors: neoclassical economics and the finance sector. One goes hand in hand with the other. They're not even supposed to do that, but that's what actually happened. So rather than the working class working less and being more secure, you now have gig workers running around everywhere with 2 or 3 jobs, delivering food, et cetera, to get enough to stay alive. And the finance sector making a fortune out of asset bubbles.
Yeah. So I know in your models, you split the world into different key players such as workers, capitalists, banks, governments and the like. But, as far as most people are concerned, there's just 2 classes, aren't there? There's those people who can afford to invest for their retirement and those people who are basically living hand to mouth. Those people who are putting money into investments long term, it's because they want a better life down the track, either for themselves or for their children. One of those groups has seen their wealth growing. The other has seen, themselves living hand to mouth more and more. Hence this big wealth gap all over the Western world. So what is the public policy response to that? Is it more progressive tax? Is it a limit to how many hours work you can do? Is it salary caps? None of those things are politically tenable, are they?
None of them are. And the one that I push for is a modern debt jubilee, which is, as you said, we made a huge mistake letting debt accelerate. I'll have to send you the graphic to illustrate this particular podcast with for the UK, because nothing screams we're doing something terribly wrong and it's all falling apart more than the profile of the level of private debt in the UK. And as I said, literally flatlining at 80% of GDP for 40 years and then blasting up to 225% that looks at the peak, and now it's down to 160%. It is just a case of, oh dear, we did something wrong. How are we going to correct it? And the best way to correct it would be to use the state's capacity to create money to cancel private debt. We should never have let it get past, in the UK's case, the 80% level that was working very effectively before Maggie Thatcher opened up a handbook, pulled out Milton Friedman and stuffed up the planet.
Right. So, but that private debt was coming from the wealthy, though, not from the less wealthy.
No, it's not coming from the wealthy. It's coming from the banks creating the money. Pardon me, mate. Sorry, I've been dealing with too many neoclassicals this week.
Yeah, no, but but the people getting those loans from the bank are, the wealthier part of society.
Not particularly. No, it's now that over time what they accumulate is actually the wealthy are more likely to be the owners of the banks than vice versa. What you had was to get into the right. What did she call it? The right to buy. The right to buy. You also needed the right to borrow. And that deregulating and meaning that not just building societies could lend for housing, but also banks. That's what caused the house price bubble in the UK's in specific case. There's plenty of other instances, similar sort of different social structures, similar dynamics around the rest of the world. So the money was borrowed by everybody. You had to borrow to get onto the ladder. But over time, as you repaid that debt, and you had the capacity coming out of, you're repaying out of your wages, somebody else is repaying out of their profits. One ends up being debt free, the other ends up being in debt peonage.
So if that hadn't happened, if Maggie Thatcher, if we go back in time and Arnold Schwarzenegger stops Margaret Thatcher from being born,
that's a thought. That's Terminator with class.
It's a rather esoteric movie, but it could work. So if we didn't do that in the UK, I mean, we'd still the experience overseas, but maybe they were copying the UK that to buy houses to increase their prices. So people have to borrow more, therefore the finance sector grows, and so it goes on. If that hadn't happened, would we have a more productive economy, and why? Yes, why would that be?
I think for a start, one of the weird things which turned up in my modelling of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis was that the increase in level of debt was paid for not by the people who were doing the borrowing in my model, which is strictly the capitalist borrowing to build factories, but by the workers. And this is where complex dynamics comes in. The overall driving factor in a capitalist economy is how much capitalists are willing to invest. This is one of Kolesky's points as well. So investment determines your level of economic activity. And the economic activity, the level of investment is fundamentally determined by the profit rate. Below a certain profit rate, why would you in the aggregate invest? Above it, you want to invest more than you earn. So what this means is there's some sort of target share of, let's say, 20% we'll say 20% will do as an example. 20% of income going to capitalists, 80% going to the rest of society. When you hit that 20% point, then capitalists start borrowing money to invest and you grow more rapidly. But the debt also grows. You'll have a boom coming out of that and then a slump. And when the slump gets you back to where you were beforehand in terms of the percentage you're going to capitalists, back to the 20% point again, at that point, it doesn't really matter to the capitalists who's got the other 80%. Well, if the debt level's risen, and that's what it did both in my model and also in the empirical world, there's a high level of private debt, meaning a high amount of the income is going to the banks and a lower amount going to workers. And that's what's turned up in the American data too. The increase in level of private debt has been matched by a falling workers' share. So we have if you want to get rid of the inequality and to get more money back in the hand of workers who, surprise, surprise, spend more rapidly than capitalists do, then you want to reduce the level of private debt.
Right, which gets back to the whole idea of the debt jubilee, doesn't it?
Yep.
But when you start talking about workers and capitalists, I mean, capitalists, no doubt, they do exist and they make a lot of money. Just the term workers is talking about a manufacturer, implies a manufacturing-based economy. And we're moving on from that now. So, and I'm just not quite sure how that changes a lot of these models and our predictions for how money is made.
Well, I think
because a lot of it is non-scalable now, isn't it? The service sector, for example, smaller businesses, less scalability. So a lot of those old models where you invest for growth don't really apply.
Yeah, there's been deindustrialization as well, which of course benefits the owners of the corporations that have moved offshore. So again, you get this skewed impact. The wealthy, who are the owners of the corporations that move offshore, do very nicely out of paying lower wages to third world workers than they were previously paying to UK workers. So it's again allowing a level of footloose capitalism and believing that is the best possible way to run a society.
But what is the alternative? Supposing it wasn't moving stuff overseas or workers offshore, that there were machines that were capable of producing stuff domestically. The sorts of machines. Where was I heard this quote recently? I might be giving you a quote back to yourself. Where machines that really can be operated by one man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure the man doesn't touch the machine for fear of stuffing it up. We're getting to this level of automation where, as Keynes was predicting back in 1930, that we might not need to do very much. But you've still got to have people who own those machines and invest in that capital. And they're obviously going to be wealthy people borrowing from banks, and poor people are just not going to be needed anymore. So how do we get over that issue? That's
one reason that I'm I know that a lot of the MMT crowd are anti the idea of universal basic income, but I think we're actually moving in that direction technologically. If we didn't face climate change, we'd get there. But if you see we mentioned Musk a moment ago. Have you seen Musk's robot? The very humanoid looking robot. capacity of that machine now to be shown how to do a task which involves using its hands to manipulate objects and placing them in boxes or whatever else is so high that they could replace a huge amount of unskilled labour. And like I don't know how many people in the conversation have ever worked in a factory. I've done it a few times in my student days, and fundamentally what you're told is, okay, to weld this piece of aluminium here, you've got to put the machine above the where the joints are needed. Make sure the linking piece of aluminium there as well. Squeeze the trigger, and that will bring the two clips together on your fuse down to the top of the bottom. Blah blah blah. You can show them one of these robots how to do that, and within about 30 minutes, worker is no longer needed. Now, if we rely upon labour as a way to generate income for the vast majority of population, then the vast majority of population is not going to get an income.
Yeah.
And that's why I think ultimately we have to move to a UBI.
Right. Before we get there, because that's going to take that almost becomes communism again, doesn't it? The argument is, well, hang on a second. Then, so who's investing in those machines? Is it wealthy industrialists or is it the state? Why not the state? But if it's the state, then they are in control of the means of production. You're sort of getting back to communism.
It's not an easy situation to solve at all. That's true. But what you I think need is we have to solve the ecological problem. That's what's going to bring all this unstuck anyway. But if we can feasibly imagine having done that, then you're going to have a future where, first of all, you want those robots in outer space rather than on the planet, which is again becoming feasible. But secondly, you then have a basic income provided for everybody. And if you want more, you have to innovate. And those innovations can come from anywhere. I mean, I'm working on my Ravel software. I don't qualify as a capitalist, but if this sells, I will become a capitalist. And therefore, that gives you an encouragement to innovate if you come up with an idea you really think is going to work. But you need the basic income to survive as well. So I can see a future society which will be divided into a vast majority who got a universal basic income and were paid by that to stay alive and do what they wished. And certainly there'd be huge amounts of work where one of the most important elements would be teaching, training a future generation to understand what the knowledge accumulated by the prior generation. That's absolutely vital. And that's done far better face-to-face and human to human than it is machine to human. So there's still going to be an enormous number of roles for people, but nothing. The manufacturing sector roles a huge part of the service sector, which reflects the need to manage finances and manage logistics and so on. That's going to be taken over by machinery and computer software. And we therefore are going to have, if we relied upon what we currently do, which is the wage to give people an income, then something at the order of 40% of the population would miss out. And that is not a functional society.
Right, so then we're getting back to what John Maynard Keynes had predicted in 1930, where you're working 15 hours a week, and as he says, it's to satisfy the old Adam, again, whatever that is. Presumably it's the, keeping your brain occupied and looking for innovative ideas that you're discussing, which, might mean that some people suddenly turn into capitalists, which is exactly what you've been describing. So that was pretty much what he's saying. But I mean, we want to have wealthy people, don't we? So you mentioned Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk wants to take people to Mars. He's got this robot that you were talking about. Richard Branson wants to open us all up to space travel. They don't need more money. They're probably not borrowing a great deal for a lot of this because they have a lot of money themselves. Or if they are, they're getting easy lines of credit because they've got quite a few assets themselves. That's healthy, isn't it? That if you have people like this who, so long as they are visionaries and they are, they can set up some base funding themselves, perhaps they are moving the global agenda forward, and that is a good thing. I mean, the fact that Elon Musk might have lost his mind a little bit lately, but generally, I mean, it's good to have a few wealthy people.
It's good to have people to innovate and get rewarded for innovation, and that includes the artist world as well. So we have rewarded people to some extent there, but it's the dead hand of inheritance in many ways that leads to the people making a fortune out of what their parents did, and then being angry about. There's a certain name called Hancock comes to mind from Australia. And I think it's the L'Oreal fortune in France as well. People who living off the wealth that their parents generated for them and then criticizing other people for not doing the same. So we need to have a class awareness, which is something we've driven out of economics by the neoclassicals. And once you have that class awareness, we also need the awareness that where wealth comes from, when in general, is an increase in the amount of energy we use and the amount of energy that is therefore available for consumption. That's where the wealth difference lies between, you and me and your grandmother having to stoke coal herself in their own house to keep the place warm. So that the ignorance we've had about social distribution of income, class structure, and energy of what got us into our current quandary.
But how do you get over that distribution of income question? Is it just tax more? I mean, it's interesting that I'm buffering at the edge now, and I don't feel like I am particularly wealthy. I've got a mortgage till I'm 74 years old. For goodness' sake, I've got in a nice house, but it's not a grand house. It's what you'd consider an average family home, suburban family home. But I'm buffering at the edge now, where if I don't put money into my pension and reduce my income by doing that, then I lose. I'm at the point now where I lose every extra pound that I earn. I lose my personal allowance. So there's £12,500, which you don't pay any tax on. The first £12,500. Once you earn over a certain level, then you lose that, and so that increases the amount of tax. You're also in a higher tax bracket, so you get to the stage where actually for every pound you're earning, you're paying 60% in tax, and that is that's the point where you go, well, I'm not going to earn that. Then I'm going to have a better retirement. I'm going to put that money into a pension fund. So I'm going to create an income for all these fund managers, and so the finance sector grows because of a tax policy. So generally, if I wasn't earning quite as much and everyone else was in that same boat, because of course that those assets I'm buying are inflating the price of those assets. If I earned a little bit less and so did everybody else, then that wouldn't be happening quite so much. So hence, getting back to the question, are we earning too much? If we earned a little bit less,
I think this is where the ecological issue comes in as well. We've got to reduce our level of consumption on this planet, and the only way that can be done in a socially viable way is if it falls primarily on the wealthy rather than the poor. That's because the poor at the moment in the UK in particular, I mean, the amount of homelessness there is breathtaking, as you're probably aware. The poor can't afford to cut back anything like the rich can on their consumption level. So a consumption-obsessed society is not viable.
But what do you do about that?
Well, if you don't do anything about it, we're going to find out the hard way what happens from the ecological point of view.
For sure, and how do you do it? Do you do it through tax policy? There's an answer to all of these things. Tax too highly, they'll go and live in America because they're they like people getting wealthier. I mean, how do you solve that problem of the income divide?
Yeah. I think it's more of a dilemma than a problem. Okay, what you're really saying is we've got ourselves caught in a whole series of conundrums where any way out involves things like capitalist flight to another country. So you don't have a simple solution, and this is the dilemma of having followed an unsustainable trail and trend for half a century. And the same on the ecological front. We should have been pulling back and reducing our emphasis upon consumption 50 years ago, which is what the limits to growth advised us to. We didn't, and we are now facing a calamity where if we don't do it, then the ecology itself will impose that on us.
Right. So, and fundamentally, getting back to, how much we should all be earning, we should really be only earning as much as we want to consume. And that means that those people who've got some excess, it is a question of, as we talked about, consumption and production should equal each other. And if I am consuming more than I'm producing, then that is at the expense of somebody else, unless you're starting to look at a higher level of debt. And that is part of the problem.
Yeah. I'll leave it at that.
But it fundamentally means that the solution to all of this is how we lend money out.
Yeah, I mean, we've let the finance sector go crazy in the belief that, all the stuff that Milton Friedman pushed about liberating capitalism, blah, 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 actually ended up castrating capitalism and liberating financial speculation. And that's we're living in a world where we've had so many decades of being dominated by financial speculation. We think it's normal. It's not normal. It's what brought us to our current set of dilemmas. We have to cauterize, castrate the financial sector, not the capitalists, and try to build a viable society where we're aware of where our growth and wealth comes from, largely from increasing energy consumption. And we realize, oh dear, we've done too much of that as well. We simply have to cut back, and that will force us into a society, whether we want to or not, where consumption is drastically curtailed because the environmental damage is just too extreme.
Right. But if we want to get to the level where we're sort of like we're not borrowing as much, we are just consuming what we earn, and we're not expanding beyond that because we can't afford to borrow. The answer to that is make it so that you can't afford to borrow. High interest rates. Hey, look what's happening.
No, not high interest rates. Limit credit creation. This is the whole idea that banks can lend as much as they like implies they're masters of the universe when they don't even know what the universe is. We allowed banks to create far too much money for unproductive uses in the belief that being a banker was something special that gave you some special skills other people don't. No, it's not. It's a political power granted by the state that lets you establish a banking license. And once you have the banking license, you could actually create money. And the easiest way to create money is to get people to borrow money against more bricks and mortar, which is what's happened. Right. So
lending regulations that say, well, you can only invest in, or you've got to have a certain proportion which goes into, however we term it, productive assets.
Yeah, absolutely. And then finance capitalism has to be the servant of industrial capitalism, not the reverse.
Right, okay. Well, that might work, mightn't it? Will it happen? Not in a hurry, that's for sure. But okay, we've once again highlighted the issue without necessarily having a resolution to it. But maybe we're getting closer. Maybe people are starting to realise the issue a bit more now, perhaps because it's reaching such an extreme level. Anyway, I know you've got COVID, so well done for battling through, and hopefully you're all over it by this time next week. Good to talk, Steve.
Thank you, mate. I'll cough at the close of my
No, thank you. We might all catch it. Catch you soon. Cheers.
Okay, bye.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.